Bonjour, welcome to Wahsa Distance Education Center's radio Zoom classes. This is SVN3E, grade 11 workplace science, and I'm the teacher, Bronwyn Slate. If you'd like to participate live today, you can call the Wahsa studio at 1-800-465-7144 or 737-4017. You can listen on the radio at 91.9 FM and on the television at Bell Express View Channel 972. You're always welcome to join me live through the Zoom link, which is available from me, your teacher, and also from your DEC. Our classes are scheduled on Monday through Thursday from 10 to 11 in the morning. And we are in our third week of our 9-week course. At this point, you should be starting to think about what work to submit for marking. A reminder that the key questions are all marked with a key icon and listed at the end of each of your IL lessons. So please do all of these questions. Some of them are check your understanding questions. Some are activities and some are review questions. So do them all and make sure you're explaining your ideas and thoughts in complete sentences so I can truly understand what it is that you're talking about. And also make sure that you're actually answering the question. You're welcome to do this by hand or electronically. If you want to write in your workbook, you can, it's yours, but those spaces in where the questions are pretty small. So I would suggest that you don't do that and write on a separate piece of paper to send to me. If you're going to do it electronically, Word and Google Doc files are the easiest files for me to open. Google Doc are accessible for all students with your NNEC email account. And if you're unsure how to access them, let me know and I can walk you through that. If you're going to use a different file type, that's totally fine. Just let me know so we can make sure that I can actually access them and open your files. All right, so how do you submit your work for marking? So the first method is to send your work electronically. You can scan your completed work if you've done it by hand and send it through your device. If you have an Apple device, the Notes app has a scan function. And if you have an Android device, the Google Drive app has a scan function. Both are fairly straightforward to use, and I'm happy to support you if you're not sure how to do it. If you need to take pictures, because that's the only way that you can do it, that's fine too. Scanning just means that they're a little bit smaller and easier to send, but you decide what works best for you. Then you can send it to me either through email to studentwork@nnec.on.ca and cc it to bronwyn.slate@nnec.on.ca, or you can send it to me through Facebook Messenger at bslatewahsa. The second method is to drop your work off in Sioux Lookout. We have an outdoor mailbox at our 74 Front Street location. We're the bright red building next to the post office, and we have a small white mailbox next to our side entrance. We are not yet open to the public, hopefully soon, but for now, just put your work into that white mailbox and I will get it back to you as soon as I can. The third method is to hand your work into your DEC. Then your DEC can either send your work through the Express or fax it to 807-737-1732 or toll-free fax to 1-800-463-7852. You can also connect with me through social media, both my Facebook and my YouTube channel under the name bslatewahsa. Feel free to friend me on Facebook and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you get notifications every time I upload one of our lessons. All of our radio Zoom classes are recorded and I post them shortly after airing onto YouTube in a playlist called SVN3E, and then I share them on Facebook. So it's just a really easy way to access all of our classes if you need to come back to them or if you're unable to join us live. Also, there's a list of supplementary videos under the playlist SVN3E so that you can see where all of our videos that we watch in class are available on YouTube. You can get them directly from their original sources and access them there. Science is a really visual subject and I work hard to incorporate as many videos and diagrams, visuals, pictures, graphics as possible. It really helps us understand what's going on holistically opposed to just listening to me talk or looking at words. So I really strongly encourage you to access the videos however you can. Either joining me live through Zoom, even just to watch and not interact, that's fine. Or accessing on YouTube is really going to set you up for the most success. However, if you don't have reliable internet and you can't do that, that makes complete sense. And if you let me know, I can send you a copy of the recordings so that you can still have the full experience. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out and contact me. I am working my way through connecting with all of my students, but if you can contact me, that is great as well. So my email address is bronwyn.slate@nnec.on.ca, and my Facebook is B-Slate Wahsa. You can call me at the office at 807-737-1488, extension 2209, or toll free 1-800-667-3703. My office hours are Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. Though if you can't connect with me during those hours, let me know and we can try to get a time that works for both of us. I think it's really important to position myself within the context of this course as it shapes how I teach and how I interact with my students, what I think is important. So I have white settler ancestry, I have white privilege, and this has made my education experience easier just based on that. I recognize this is not the experience of many folks, particularly the students taking who are Wahsa students. And I work hard to disrupt that cycle as it is not something that I want to contribute to, but I do benefit from it. And it is something that is hard for me I can't necessarily always see outside of it. So it's something that I'm continuing to work on addressing and dealing with. I do live in Northwestern Ontario on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe people. And I work to honor and learn from this culture and the people in this community in order to integrate that into this course. As an educator, however, I have lots to learn and unlearn. It is a lifelong process, and I'm committed to doing it, but I definitely make mistakes and don't have everything figured out. So if anyone has any suggestions or feedback, I'm happy to hear that and work on improving. Also, our textbook is Eurocentric. I've noticed that many of the examples, if not all the examples, are situated around the white experience. So either white or European centric scientists, values and views, or white communities are the examples or topics that are talked about within the book. And this is problematic and really erases and ignores the experiences of Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis, both their knowledges and experiences of these peoples. So this is really problematic and something that I would like to work towards changing. However, I've not been able to find another resource that is more appropriate or inclusive. And I don't want to just settle for something that is equally dismissive. So something that I'll continue to work on. If folks have any suggestions, again, I will happily welcome that. All right, so we are continuing with Unit 2 today, maintaining healthy ecosystems. We're wrapping this one up. So remember that we've been talking about ecosystems and how they clean our water, purify our air, maintain our soil, regulate our climate, recycle nutrients, and provide us with food. So they are basically the structure of all of our life. So we talked about how ecosystems are harmed and based on human activities. And we talked yesterday, our last lesson, about oil spills and acidic precipitation. Today, we're going to continue by looking at invasive species. And so what are invasive species and what's the effects? How do we monitor and how do we control them? And how that has an impact on the ecosystems in our communities. So our learning goals are that at the end of this lesson, you'll be able to name several invasive species in Canada and their effects on native species and ecosystems. You'll understand the techniques involved in monitoring and controlling invasive species as well. You know you've met the learning goals because you know both plant and animal invasive species. You can explain the impacts invasive species have on ecosystems, and you can describe the techniques used to help ecosystems to recover and prevent future devastation. All right, so let's first talk about the effects of species. People have experimented intentionally and accidentally with introducing new plant and animals to ecosystems. Most often, the results have been costly and disastrous. So it is better not to introduce new plants and animals into an environment because most likely it is not going to turn out well. So what do we mean by native species? So this is a species that normally lives and thrives in a particular ecosystem. So a species is a group of organisms that reproduce only with each other and grow and act and look alike. So it's important to know this vocabulary. This can include any species that developed with the surrounding habitat and can be assisted by or affected by a new species. So a habitat is the region where a plant or animal naturally grows or lives. So these are important, again, important vocabulary to have. Native species are adapted or suited to live in the climate, soils, and waters in which they naturally live, and with the other species with which they share habitat and range. So native species thrive and don't hurt the environment that they're in, and they work cooperatively with the other species in that area. They are not introduced by humans. They happen naturally. They've been part of nature where they are for many hundreds or thousands of years. They usually rely on other native species with which they share their habitats. So think back to producers, consumers, and decomposers. These are the native species in an ecosystem are going to be producers, consumers, and decomposers because they work together to thrive in that area. Native species live in balance with each other in an ecosystem. Remember, producers, consumers, decomposers, they always lived in balance. So here are a few native species to our area. There are the black bears, swans, moose, lynx, quail, martens, blue herons, and then also these plants, which I'm not going to remember the names of the plants. I know my animals better than my plants. Birch trees. This might be black spruce. This doesn't look like lilacs, but maybe it's lilacs. And I don't know what this flower's name is. I should have written them down. So those are native species in our area, but what about non-native species? So non-native species are a species that originated somewhere other than its current location and has been introduced to the area where it now lives. The introduction of non-native species has happened largely due to international travel and trade, agriculture, and the release of exotic pets and plants into the wild, and the use of live bait. So, as you can see, all of these are human activities. So, international travel and trade, that's all because of us. Agriculture is because of humans. The release of exotic pets and plants, so humans releasing pets and plants into the wild, and the use of live bait is us trying to catch things. So that's all. Non-native species are generally because of human activities. They may come both from distant lands or from nearby areas. This is not all just coming across the ocean. This could be moving from one ecosystem and environment to another, even only a few hours away. So you can see that the number of new introductions from this graph, we can see that it happened a little bit. It slowly was increasing in the 17 and the 1800s. Yes, there were introductions, but the 1900s and the 2000s, you can see it has exponentially increased. It's skyrocketed the number of new inductions of native species into new environments because there's so much travel, right? This is lots of travel and trade is when this all happened from the mid 1900s and to present. So over 185 aquatic species have been introduced to the Great Lakes alone. 1,229 non-native plant species have been introduced, though 316 are from other areas in Canada. So, but this is all non-native plants that are in Canada now. Over 800 species of insects and diseases has been brought into Canada, and 12% of the 11,950 species assessed in the Wild Species 2010, the general status of species in Canada, are not native. So 12% of the species in Canada are not native. Here are some non-native species. These ones I did write the names on. Gray partridge, a red-eared slider turtle, a house sparrow, a weeping willow, and the common lilac, which I said that the other one was a lilac, but I was wrong. So these are all non-native species that are now in Canada. All right, so we've talked about native species and non-native species, but then what is an invasive species, which is the focus of this lesson? So a species of plant or animal that outcompetes other species, causing damage to an ecosystem. So either a plant or animal that overtakes a space as part of an ecosystem. So while it's impossible to say exactly how many invasive species are living in Canada, in 2002, researchers estimated that at least 1,442 invasive species, including fish, plants, insects, and invertebrates, now live in the country's farmlands, forests, and waterways. So that's a lot of invasive species, things that are taking up space and making it not easy for the native species to survive and thrive. So they're concerning for the following reasons. They compete directly with native species for food and habitat. They reduce local biodiversity and put added pressures on endangered or at-risk species. They spread diseases like Lyme disease to humans and botulism to fish and shore and birds through aquatic and land-based food webs. They killed agricultural crops and native trees. They cost billions in management fees and lost economic value of crops, forests, and fisheries. So if these diseases are affecting crops, trees, and animals, then the money that we make off of them we can't get because they've been killed because of these invasive species. So how do invasive species spread? So invasive species are often introduced to new habitats accidentally, though humans are almost always involved in some way. When ocean-going ships empty their ballasts, a compartment at the base of the vessel used to help it balance in waterways, that water, often taken on in distant parts of the world, can carry numerous species not native to the basin. So bringing water over in oceans ships and dumping it here, though unintentional, because that's not the purpose, but not being conscious of the fact that there are going to be plants, animals, and bacteria and things like that in that water means that it introduces these invasive species. Then climate change is another key way invasive species spread throughout Canada. Deer ticks who carry Lyme disease were once controlled by cold winters, but now are more and more common. Humans have introduced some species to new regions in Canada to serve as an ecological function or for recreational purposes. Chinook and coho salmon were increased in the 1960s, both to control alewives and other invasive fish and to create a sport fishery for salmon. So here are some invasive species in Canada. So zebra mussels, garlic mustard, Eurasian milfoil, this is in water, wild pigs, autumn olive, New Zealand mud snail, giant hogweed, European frogbit, spongy moth, and round goby. These are all things that are now in our areas that were not originally here and now are taking over space. All right, so now you should be able to answer the questions on page 55, the check your understanding questions 1 through 3, just knowing what the differences are between native species, non-native species, and invasive species. But now let's talk about how we monitor and control these species. So every new invasive species has costs associated with it. These are costs we cannot afford to ignore. Unfortunately, established invasive and non-native species are usually impossible to fully eliminate. However, we can lessen their impacts by monitoring and controlling their population. So let's look at what monitoring means. This consists of checking and testing for non-native and invasive species. Done at sites considered vulnerable or where populations of invasive species are suspected or known. and it involves preparing a database of native and invasive species and populations at a site. So this is done through surveys using aerial photography, counting, netting, and taking water samples. So similar to the way that we've talked about monitoring before, this also happens when we're looking for species, as that's part of what can be tracked and paid attention to in order to figure out what needs to happen. This information is used to prepare plans in case of new introductions. So it's better to be preventative opposed to reactive. It's better to have a plan about how we're going to deal with it if something happens, opposed to having to deal with it after it's already happened and we're running out of time. So this is a flowchart that's in your workbook that talks about how monitoring happens. So first, an area has an assessment or a risk analysis, and we figure out, is something happening already in the area? Is there already an invasive species? Is there already a non-native species? What are the impacts happening? If there isn't, what are the risks of an invasive or non-native species coming in from nearby sources or from travel or trade or things like that? Then if there is any early detection, then there's a rapid response plan put in place in order to deal with it quickly. If there isn't any problem, then there's first prevention happens, so that hopefully nothing will happen. And that from there, did the prevention work? Yes, then they continue to prevent. If it didn't work, then it goes to the early detection, rapid response. Hopefully that paying attention, monitoring well, and keeping this database in order to make sure that we know what's going on means that we have early detection. We can figure it out early so that it isn't a big problem. And then a quick response means that we deal with it. Did that work? Yes, then we can go back to prevention and hopefully continue that cycle that it just preventing it happens, that instead of reacting, preventing. If the monitoring didn't work, we go to control and management, or in the risk and assessment, if we've recognized that there is an invasive species dealing or a non-native species that we need to deal with, then we deal with control and management, which we're going to talk about more in a moment. So then if the control worked, we monitor that. If the control worked, then we go back to prevention. If it didn't, the control failed and we need to figure out something else. We need to start again and hopefully figure out a better tactic. So what does control even mean? So here, this also is a chart from your workbook. So those steps that we were just looking at. So at the prevention level, we're trying to make it so that we prevent any invasive species from coming in. So an example of where this was used, if we have suspected shipments or materials are turned away or quarantined at border entry points. So if we think we have a ship that is going to introduce an invasive species, we turn them away, we say that you can't come in, or we quarantine them in order to deal with the species before it arrives and invades our ecosystems. We have the maintenance of the database on habitats and native and invasive species. So we have that information accessible and updated constantly. And then we have public education campaigns. So things about, like, if you go camping, seeing things where it says, don't take your firewood from one camping spot to another camping spot, because it can have bugs that travel and then become invasive species. So that's one example of a public campaign that would be prevention. So then 2 examples of how invasive species have been controlled using prevention are the Asian longhorn beetle and the emerald ash borer beetle. So then the second stop is, if prevention doesn't work, then early detection and elimination where possible. So examples of how this is used is, again, having ongoing monitoring and advanced planning to deal with invasions. So having a plan, not only detecting it early, but having a plan to how you're going to deal with it. So the West Nile virus was an example of how this invasive species, the virus, was controlled and not spread. Then if early detection and elimination does not work, then containment and management. So having physical, chemical, and biological controls, so containing it, making sure that you're not able to spread, even if you can't eliminate it completely, making it so that it is maintained and doesn't have a greater impact. And purple loosestrife and sea lamprey are 2 examples of how invasive species are controlled. They are not eliminated, but they are controlled. And then ecosystem restoration wasn't on the flowchart, but this is how we recover. So returning native species to their habitats is how we do restoration in order to help those ecosystems to come back to health. An example of this are the artificial ponds at the Don Valley Brickworks in Toronto. Now are supporting native species of frogs, fish, birds, and mammals. So these ponds had to be built because they were not thriving, not surviving. And these native species were introduced back and are now doing well. All right, so we're going to look at a video that gives us a bit of an example about, it talks about purple loosestrife, which is one of the invasive species that has been able to be controlled and managed in Ontario and in Canada. And so we're just going to look at this example to figure out, to learn a little bit more how this process works.
And your workbook talks about it a little bit, but this, just being able to see it, gives us a little bit more information and makes it a little bit more tangible and understandable.
Until the mid-'80s, when someone had the idea of investigating biological control.
Today, the quiet efforts of a tiny leaf-feeding beetle are leading to the large-scale control of purple loosestrife, one of Ontario's most tenacious wetland invaders. Purple loosestrife is a wetland plant. It is an invasive plant. It's an exotic plant that came from Europe many, many years ago in the 1800s. It produces lots of seeds, and it spreads very quickly. And it moved into a lot of wetlands in North America.
And that impacted virtually hundreds of species that survive in wetlands. It impacted the way the wetlands function in terms of water recycling and water clarification and so on.
And at that point, it's not the best for wildlife. It can get so dense that wildlife can't get through it. Left unchecked, it becomes a real problem for our wetlands.
In Ontario, concern was mounting and purple loosestrife populations were exploding. Shorelines of rivers and lakes, roadsides, low-lying areas, and specifically wetlands were affected.
About 75% of our wetlands are threatened by development in Ontario. So when purple loosestrife was introduced, it created one more stressor on those systems that are very important in terms of ecosystem functioning and for fish and wildlife.
We've tried mechanical means to remove the purple loosestrife. The problem is, if you leave even a little piece of root there, you can end up with a new plant.
In the mid-1980s, the potential for controlling purple loosestrife naturally using a technology called biological control was being investigated. In Europe, the hunt for natural predators of purple loosestrife was on.
Biological control is a management technique that involves taking a non-native invasive species and going back to the place of origin of that species and finding its natural predators, and then essentially reuniting them.
Well, not just any natural predator will do. They have to be thoroughly tested. They must be safe to use. The risk to other species, especially native species, must be low.
That is important when we're looking for biocontrol agents. Is we need to find something that's host-specific, something that isn't going to feed on anything else.
In 1992, after years of testing, Agriculture Canada approved 2 species of beetle for release in Canada.
The Galaricello beetles are leaf-feeding beetles, and the larvae and the adults both feed on the leaves and the stems of the plant. These species have co-evolved over the years, and now they've become so specific with one another that the beetles can't survive without purple loosestrife. That's not an unusual relationship in the plant insect world.
And these beetles have evolved, much like the monarch butterfly has evolved with milkweed, these have evolved with the loosestrife, and that's all that they feed on, so that's why we're using them here.
Extensive testing and monitoring have been done in both the U.S. and Ontario to ensure that the beetles are not affecting native plant populations by switching their food preference.
All the research that's been done to date shows that the beetles do not have any negative impacts on native plant species in North America.
Initially, releases were by the University of Guelph, but the project soon blossomed to include a collective of governments, conservation groups, and volunteers. The Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters Project Purple was aimed at education.
Through a number of different agencies, they've now been released at over 400 locations in Ontario alone.
And what effects have the beetles had in Ontario?
The impact of the beetles has just been phenomenal. Because of this feeding action, the plants start to get smaller in size, the root masses shrink, the flowering is cut back, and because there's fewer flowers, fewer seeds are produced. With time, individual plants can disappear altogether, and with more time, plant communities can be drastically affected just through the feeding action of the beetles.
As the numbers of beetles increases, the adults fly to find more plants. In areas where there are lots, they can be collected and moved around to new locations.
We cut the stems that have the insect larvae on them, and we collect them, and we can actually transfer them.
Today, the threat of this invasive plant species, once considered a beautiful killer of Ontario's wetlands, is changing.
The landscape is really changing. We're hearing from people, what happened to purple loosestrife? Is it not a problem anymore? We're just not seeing it. Essentially, the beetles can now be found in virtually every watershed in southern Ontario, and also in a number of watersheds in northern Ontario.
And because the program has focused on watersheds, the ecosystems have helped the beetles along.
On over 80% of the sites where the insects were released, there's impact to the purple loosestrife.
But the plants are not disappearing altogether. Loosestrife will always be a part of the plant communities here in Ontario.
The beetles don't eradicate the plants. Purple loosestrife is their only source of food, so it's not in their best interest to get rid of all of the loosestrife. And there can be fluctuations with time in the number of beetles and the amount of loosestrife in a location.
The numbers of plants get down to the point where it's just a nice pretty flower in amongst the wetland vegetation. That will control the numbers of beetles that we have.
So what we're really seeing is large tracts of watersheds where loosestrife is still there, but it's much less apparent than it was 10 years ago, for example. So biological control returns that wetland to a pre-invasion state. So the loosestrife is suppressed and the native plants begin to come back into that environment. And in turn, the native wildlife also will begin to come back in and use it.
This biological control success story is offering hope that a little beetle with a big appetite will control purple loosestrife and serve as an example for the control of other non-native invaders of the future.
All the work is done by nature. The solution is here before us. There's very little input required on our part now, which is one of the beautiful things about biocontrol. It's very inexpensive. It's simple, it's passive, and it's forever.
And we hope that it will help lay the groundwork for support from the public and from government for additional programs like this to address the concerns for other invasive species in the future.
So, if you know an area in Ontario where purple loosestrife is thriving, call the Invading Species Hotline. But before you do, look way down into the plants. Tiny beetles may already be there, gobbling up one of the most well-known invasive plant species of Ontario's invaluable wetlands.
So that's a really interesting case study about how biological control, how control can work and not harm the environment further. So there are some key things within that purple loose leaf reality that was super important that were not in terms of using biological control, meaning that other things will still be able to thrive and survive and not be impacted by the beetles that are focused on eating the purple loosestrife. As I was watching that this time, one thought I had and I wondered about was, with climate change, how is that going to impact the beetle, that particular beetle and plant, and will that relationship still be able to, will that biological control still work? So will the beetle be impacted by climate change and the climate crisis and therefore not be able to monitor and control the purple loosestrife, and is that going to have an impact? Though also the purple loosestrife might also not be able to survive the climate crisis and might be wiped out as well. So just interesting things to think about in terms of how all of this sort of dominoes together. Anyway, so now you can answer the questions on page 57, the check your understanding question, which talks about how an area is monitored and for invasive and native species. So that's all that we want to talk about today for invasive species. So this finishes lesson 7. Some of our lessons are a little bit more deep or full than others, but this is a shorter one. So going over what we've talked about today, the effect of species is really important to understand. So native species, non-native species, and invasive species, understanding the difference between them and how they are interconnected. We don't talk too much about, non-native species are things that are not from the area originally, but are working harmoniously with the ecosystems around it. So are not invading and taking over, whereas invasive species are species that are also not native, are not from the area, but are invading and taking over and wiping out other native species. Then we talked about monitoring and checking and testing for non-native and invasive species. So how important it is to develop this database for prediction and prevention. So having a plan in place and understanding what is likely to occur and how to make change and deal with it if negative situations were to arise. Then we have talked about control, and the 4 elements of control would be prevention. So hopefully preventing invasive species from taking root and becoming invasive in our areas. So then the second prong is early detection and elimination. So if a invasive species does manage to come in, then detecting that and eliminating it as soon as possible, if possible. Then the third tactic is the containment and management. So if we cannot eliminate it, or we've realized too late that it is already thriving in an area an invasive species is, then how do we contain it and manage it? And so that's the purple loosestrife example with the beetle, fighting those biological control methods, meaning that we are not introducing chemicals, we are not introducing pollution, we are not wiping out other or impacting the ecosystem in other ways, but figuring out methods that can manage the invasive species while not impacting the rest of the ecosystem is really important. And then finally, ecosystem restoration is how do we bring those ecosystems back to health and balance after dealing with the invasive species or containing it if we are unable to eliminate it. So hopefully you are comfortable with the success criteria and that you know both plant and animal invasive species that are local. You can explain the impact of invasive species that they have on an ecosystem. And you can describe techniques used to help ecosystems to recover and prevent further future devastation. So the key questions are a little bit different for this lesson. There's also the activity on page 58, with activity 2.4. So not only the key questions and the review questions, but also you need to do this activity on page 58. So just to look at it a little bit, the activity is answering the question, can Windy Creek Ranch be saved? And so the purpose is to analyze the spread of purple loosestrife, invasive species, and its effect on an ecosystem. So it's just to look at how purple loosestrife has spread in the past. So this is not looking at the beetle, but just looking at how easily purple loosestrife spreads. So the background of this is Windy Creek is a large cattle ranch covering 1,000 hectares. Unfortunately, an invasive plant called purple loosestrife has covered about 1 hectare of the land. Cattle do not eat purple loosestrife, and it crowds out plants that the cattle could eat. The ranchers worry that this plant will continue to spread. Research shows that the purple loosestrife population will double its size each year. As an environmental consultant, you have been asked to conduct a 6-year project to monitor the spread of this invasive species. So starting off, it says it's only covering 1 hectare out of 1,000. That doesn't feel like it's very big. That's my initial gut, is being like, 1 hectare isn't very much compared to 1,000 hectares. But because purple loosestrife spreads so easily, like we just watched in the video, they have so many seeds in their flowers and it spreads so easily that this really quickly could impact this cattle ranch. So what you need to do for this activity is, for each year, you need to think about how much is being covered by purple loosestrife and the fact that it doubles every year. So you're going to fill out this chart. So in the year 1 hectare is purple loosestrife. So what fraction of Windy Creek is covered by purple loosestrife? So thinking about that. So 1 out of how much of the whole is covered? So 1 hectare out of 1,000 is covered in purple loosestrife. So how much is free? So it's going to be the inverse. So 999 out of 1,000 doesn't have loosestrife. But then we are, for year 2, it's doubled. So now we have 2 hectares of purple loosestrife. And so you're going to continue to increase and figure out the fractions as you go in order to see how much in 6 years, how much, if we don't do anything, then how much of the land is going to be covered in purple loosestrife. Then you want to continue and you're going to create a graph, and you're going to show, you're going to make a graph of how many hectares are covered. You're going to graph all 3 of these different calculations that you've created in relation to time, in relation to years. So 1 year, what does it look like? 2 years, what does it look like? 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. And then you're going to predict how, what's going to happen at 25%, when it's going to happen 75%. So it doesn't have to be exact, but you're going to use these graphs and your calculations to predict how long it's going to take for purple loosestrife to take over Windy Creek. And then you're going to conclude, you're going to analyze your data and give some advice to the rancher, a short paragraph, and summarize your steps that you think you need to take in order for if this happened in your community. So that's how you're going to do this activity. So it's a little bit different than just the questions that we've been answering, but I believe that you have the tools that you need. If you're confused about anything or unsure how to do the graphing or anything, let me know and I can walk you through it. All right, and then we have the review questions on page 59, questions 1 through 11, which are the regular review questions that we usually been doing. So just answering these questions in as much detail as you can. All right, and so that's our lesson for today. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out and contact me. You can call me at the office at 807-737-1488, extension 2209, or toll free at 1-800-667-3703. You can email me at bronwyn.slate, and that's spelled BRONWYN.SLATE@nnec.on.ca. You connect with me through Facebook at bslate Wahsa, as well as watching our videos on YouTube, also called bslate Wahsa. So please reach out to me if you have any questions or are unsure, as well as to hand in your work. Remember, yes, sorry, anyway. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to connecting you with your next class. Miigwech.